In the previous lesson, we spent some time talking about the provisional government, the institution established out of the Duma following the February Revolution, which was to oversee the eventual transition into constituent assembly elections and eventually the creation of a democratic republic. In this lesson, we're going to spend some time talking about the sort of the mirror image of that institution, the other part of the dual power structure, this being, of course, the Petrograd Soviet. We'll talk about what the Petrograd Soviet was, some of the things that it did, and some of the issues that eventually leads us to the revolution in October. The next lesson will spend a little bit of time focusing specifically on the sort of dual power dynamics. I'm basically going to mention some of the things here and in the previous lesson as well, but I want to just cover that as a sort of separate video as well, just to consolidate all of your notes before moving on to Lenin specifically and the influence that Lenin has over this whole revolutionary process. So just like with the provisional government, the Petrograd Soviet arises out of the February Revolution. We get the sort of mass protests and the collapse of Tsarist power in February 1917. During the February Revolution, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies was formed on the 27th of February 1917, or the 12th of March if you're using the new style calendar. Stick with the 27th. 27th of February, the same day as the Duma establishes the provisional government, or the sort of embryonic format of the provisional government, we see the establishment of the Petrograd Soviet. The ways in which the deputies were elected were at a ratio of 1 to 1,000 workers or military units. This is one of the reasons, by the way, that we see that there is a perceived greater amount of legitimacy, especially among the workers and soldiers, when it comes to the Petrograd Soviet versus the provisional government. Provisional government is an offshoot of the State Duma, and the provisional government is not elected, even though it is promising elections in the future, whereas the Petrograd Soviet is directly elected as a ratio of 1 to 1,000 workers or military units. It became the parallel authority then of the provisional government. It claimed to be representing the people's interests, but again starts to lay the foundation of what becomes known as this dual power structure. The nature then of the dual power structure involved the Soviet's executive committee, the Ispolkom, which would gain concrete control over critical infrastructure. I mentioned in the last lesson that the Petrograd Soviet had control over things like roads, railway networks, and things like that. The executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet began to gain this control over the infrastructure during this time period. Things like postal services, telegraphs, railways, the press, and also, really importantly, food distribution. This is the fact that they lacked formal authority in any meaningful sense, but they had democratic legitimacy in the sense that they were representing workers and soldiers. So we know already that there was Order Number 1, which we'll get to in a second. It also established what is known as a contact commission on the 8th of March to monitor the provisional government's response to public demands. And so what this does is result in the establishment of what could be seen as a kind of shadow government, a sort of an authority that is sort of following and shadowing the authority of the provisional government, and seeing whether or not the provisional government is even responding to any of the demands of the people. Now, another major issue that we see established is Order Number 1. On the 1st of March 1917, just before the abdication of the Tsar, the official abdication of the Tsar, the Petrograd Soviet issues Order Number 1. And this is the first pivotal decree which instructed soldiers and sailors to obey officers or the provisional government only if those orders don't conflict with the Soviet's decrees, which is essentially another way of saying follow the authority of the Petrograd Soviet. Now, the reason why that's so important is that then provides you with the undermining of legitimacy of the provisional government. You can sort of maintain the allure, you can maintain the perception of following the orders of the provisional government so long as those orders do not conflict with the basic commands that are established by this Petrograd Soviet. This was a controversial order, but it was instrumental for altering military discipline and beginning to lead to the shifting of power towards the soldiers and also towards this as an elected body. It also called for the election of unit representatives to the Soviets. It also mandated that weapons remain under a committee control rather than officer control, and it also abolished the use of honorific titles to officers. So it created a military structure that was far more quote-unquote meritocratic than that of the honorific titles and the hierarchical structure that existed in the military prior to this order being established. Factory committees then very quickly began to proliferate around across all of Petrograd, fundamentally, especially in metal industries, where around 60% of the workforce of the city was based. And we can see that by October, these committees had formed the Petrograd Central Council of Factory Committees. It's a very much of a mouthful, but this would ultimately culminate in the first All-Russian Conference of Factory Committees. So that's an addition to when we see it developing.